Let's talk about Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman, Chapter 1, In Love, Conflict is Not Abuse. And remember, as the author says, this is not a book to be agreed with. This was probably my favorite chapter in the book, which is both cool and terrible, because then that means that, like, from here, my experience of reading the book got worse as it went, which wasn't great, but you know, not every book is for every person. I still think there's a lot that we can talk about from this, though, so I'm really excited to share it with you all. So we need to know how to solve interpersonal conflicts before we can ever start solving social ones. And a lot of us try to jump into activism work and making these big changes in the world when we literally can't even get through an argument with our significant others. So like, we need to start at home and then expand. Now, as much as I believe that our emotions serve us, we have them for a reason, I think that this chapter presents some really good points about the sort of value and truth we assign to things like anxiety. Because the author says that fearing that something could go wrong is not the same as actively being in danger. And I think that's a really important distinction. Having a train of thought that leads to some possibilities of things that could happen, that's not the same thing as actively having something going wrong right now. And that's something we need to learn to discern better. Similarly, feeling anxious doesn't necessarily mean that there has been some great injustice against you. In fact, she even goes so far as to say that some of our fears are purposefully constructed and are a political tool. It benefits the people in power for us to have certain feelings about certain groups of people and to have certain feelings about certain situations. A quote that I really liked was, "Confusions between projection, discomfort, and threat appear in every realm, from the most intimate to the global. From the first ping of desire to the bombardment of civilians." So again, just like in the intro, she's tying in interpersonal relationships and world issues. Section 1, The Dangerous Flirt. Now, this section is about something that a lot of us are afraid to talk about, which is uneven desire in romantic relationships. And Schulman talks about the fact that liking someone who doesn't like you back is not an assault on that person. It's not inherently harassment. It can lead to those things, but in our culture, sometimes even just the expression of emotion, especially from an oppressed person who's more likely, again, because of those politically constructed fears, to be perceived as a predator while doing nothing, it gets seen as a threat. And because of that, there's a lot of dishonesty around desire, even with ourselves. We tend to hide our feelings from ourselves if it's not towards someone who's convenient. We block access to our own feelings, and that harms not only ourselves, but our relationships to other people because we're not being genuine. This section had something that I did make a note about, though, because when she's talking about the people more likely to be perceived as a threat, one of the examples that she gives is like when the object of your desire is the wrong age. I feel like that's a thing that we have some pretty clear moral boundaries about, and that's a weird thing to add to a list of like, and gay people, and that's an association that has been made too many times. Can we stop doing that shit? So this section was mostly good, and then there was just that one little part that was like, Moving on, section 2, email, text, and negative escalation. This section is largely about how having text-based communication with another person strips conversation of a lot of the nuances, tone, body language that are required for having, especially like a conflict, something where you need to have nuanced tone, body language. And because that complexity gets stripped away, people can read things that aren't there, they can add meanings that maybe they wouldn't have added if they were looking you in the eye. And so Schulman says that when there's a miscommunication via text, it's really important to follow up face-to-face or on the phone. And where that's an accessible option for people, I agree. I think that is important. But too often, what happens when someone is emailing, texting, has a miscommunication, has a conflict with another person, is that they just stop responding. Because that's a thing that's really easy to do when you're having one of those asynchronous conversations. You can just not answer. She says that refusal to continue conversation comes from a place of rage. I think that there can be a lot of different intentions that play into why someone doesn't want to answer. But one thing I do agree with is whatever reason someone has for not answering, for not continuing the conversation, that's going to inhibit learning. So people aren't going to be able to come to a mutual place of understanding if they're not talking to each other. That could pretty much be the main takeaway of this book. People are not going to come to a place of mutual understanding if they're not talking to each other. That's the book. She does make the space here to talk about like taking space with boundaries around it. I need a day to get my thoughts together, then we can talk. Things like that. But you have to make those with the expectation that the other person might not want to listen to that. In this section, the author also puts words to something that I've observed before but didn't really know how to explain, which is, without conversation, it is the person with the most limitations who's in control. Refusal keeps the person who doesn't know how to problem solve from learning how. They are too anxious to negotiate or are paralyzed by negative fantasy about actually speaking to the dehumanized other. They cannot advance, and anyone who is controlled by their refusal cannot advance. And I gotta tell you, as someone who studies conflict skills for fun, I have often been the person who needs to follow whatever kind of limitation is set out by the other person who doesn't study conflict skills for fun. And that can be really hard. The solution that Schulman suggests here is bringing more skills to the limited person rather than limiting the person who already has the skills. Because restriction, again, is going to keep us from learning. It's going to keep us stagnant. Whereas if someone can coach that person who's too anxious to move forward, doesn't have the skills, feels too isolated, whatever it is, through learning those skills, then we can hopefully work things out. One thing that I will say seems to be missing from her writing is recognition of like whether or not people are ready to learn new skills. And in general, I get the feeling from this book that she has tried to like inflict conflict skills on people who weren't really at that place in their journey. And I wish there were a little more recognition that you're not in control of how fast someone else learns something. So as much as these are good ideas, if I'm trying to coach someone through something they don't want to be coached through, that's not necessarily going to make our relationship any healthier. In the next bit, she talks about boundary setting, the fact that it should be a negotiation and not a demand, even saying we don't need to listen to the demands of others. I agree, but I feel like we need to have a more nuanced conversation about this. Because like someone shouting, just stop talking, doesn't necessarily mean that whatever I had to say next would have been wrong. It doesn't mean that to me it feels just for us to stop the conversation. But also if someone says stop talking to me and I say no, I don't know what kind of productive conversation we're expected to have from there. I think what is much more important is having expectation settings with people before you get into a conflict and saying, hey, if things get too intense with us, let's set up a system where we take 15 minutes, where we take a day. If we get into a conflict, let's stop, go to a coffee shop, talk it out. But the author seems to think that this is planning that should be done in an active conflict, which is never the time to be making plans with another person. And while I do think it's wrong to demand that someone just shut up, I don't think the right answer is to respond with no, and I don't think that's going to be a moment where you're going to be able to have a negotiation with another person. A question she asked that I thought was really thought-provoking was, why would a person rather have an enemy than a conversation? Like, we have this idea about conflict in our society that it's better to be transgressed, to be the victim, than to have shared responsibility. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have a very blame-based model of conflict. Someone has to be wrong and someone has to be right. And it can't just be that like we had a miscommunication. It can't just be that we had different expectations going in. Like, there has to be this imbalance. What would be so much better is if we do have a system where we can both have messed something up a bit. Because it's usually not true that conflict is the hurt one and the one who hurt them. There might have been one person who initiated the conflict. They did something hurtful towards the other. But, and this is all stuff we're going to talk about more, there's context, and that context matters. Section 3, the final section of this chapter, reductive modes of a logic. So this section is about how we want shortcuts to talk about stuff, and it doesn't really work because being a human's really complicated. We want to make slogans for issues that are snappy and get attention and they sound really good, but that doesn't really work. It doesn't truly map to the human experience. So one example is the slogan, believe women, which on the surface, yeah, of course. But then also, how many cases in history have there been of a white woman positioning her white womanhood against a man of color, especially a black man? Another thing that I think is really important that the author touches on is that there are a lot of situations in which women are dishonest because they have to be, because there are societal expectations on women that mean they have to act a certain way, but also because, again, going back to that blame-based system that we have, if a woman has any responsibility for a conflict that happened, well, suddenly it's her fault. And we've all seen this, right? The question, what was she wearing? We've heard it 1,000 times. A quote from this section, in a world based on blame, women have to be clear to be clean. So avoiding blame means avoiding complexity, contradictions, and ambivalences. So we live in this world where there are groups of people who basically have to claim they've been abused to have any credibility. And what we need is a world where it's okay for a no to be a little more complex than no, and for a yes to be a little more complex than yes. But we don't currently have a world where it's safe, and so we have these very black and white views on things that honestly aren't serving any of us. One concept in this section that I think is really tough to grapple with is the idea that making an accusation does not make us right. We have these two conflicting ideas in society where people are innocent until proven guilty, but the second that anyone makes an accusation, we need to believe them, not ask for any clarification, not get any context on what happened, and trying to do so, trying to clarify, is seen as blaming them, hurting them, disbelieving them, and so you can't even get the whole story if someone's made an accusation, and that's a problem. But when we're the ones in that conflict, when we're feeling transgressed, we have the option to take a step back and try to clarify what happened. We can use our discernment skills and figure out, is what happened abuse? What choices did I make in the situation? What was the context around it? And again, these things are not about shifting blame. That is not the point here. The point is to get the whole story and to try to see more conflicts as a situation where people made choices and it went badly, rather than a situation where there was an evil bad guy who decided to hurt a totally innocent person. The last bit of this chapter that I want to talk about is Shulman mentions, no answer is not an answer and silence is not accountable. I think a lot of us have gotten used to just not answering messages that make us uncomfortable, just ignoring people we don't feel like dealing with. And honestly, that's a habit I have mixed feelings about. As a creator on TikTok, I block a lot of people. I'm not being accountable to those people, and I'm actively making the decision not to. But I do think this is worth considering in day-to-day life, in the way that we treat our friends, our family, our loved ones. If there are people we have decided to make a commitment to, we have a responsibility to honor them and to answer them and to work through things together and remain as a community. I do think it's okay to not want to be friends with someone anymore. I think it's okay to not always want to be accountable to the same person for the rest of your life. But I do think the kind thing to do, the responsible thing to do, is to have that conversation well. It will be painful and difficult, but when we shun people, we're only making it painful and difficult for them and putting ourselves in a bubble. We're not actually removing the pain and the difficulty, we're just offsetting it. So I do think the more responsible thing to do is to go through some of that processing together before we close that door. Thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you want to, if you liked watching this, if you want to hear more of what I have to say about books. And thanks so much to my patrons on Patreon who made this happen. See you next time when we talk about Chapter 2, Abandoning the Personal.